If you've been watching my channel for any length of time, you'll probably know one obvious fact about me, which is that I feel a lot. I am very, very in touch with my feelings, and I feel them very, very strongly, and this has been true ever since I can remember. My earliest emotional memories are ones where instead of feeling happy, I feel ecstatic and elated. And instead of feeling sad, I feel like I'm in the darkest, most dismal pits of depression. I feel a lot and I feel strongly. It's how I've always been. However, in spite of that truth, I don't find it very easy to cry. I don't cry often, especially as a result of reading a book or watching a film. So often people talk about crying after they read a book or watch a film, and I understand. And it does happen, just not that often. The exception for me is music. Music will make me cry very, very easily. Even songs that don't particularly sound sad, but have sad lyrics. And now that I'm on a daily dose of estrogen, I do cry a lot more easily, but once again, music is to blame. I cry at music constantly. All of that said, there is still a handful of books that have made me cry. And one of them was a very recent read. I cried while reading a book just a few weeks ago. So that got me thinking, what other books have actually made me shed a tear? Or several. And I found 5. So let's talk about them. These are the 5 books that have actually made me cry. If you've read this novel, this one will feel very, very obvious. I think this is a book that makes most people cry when they read it. This is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. I've talked many times about the fact that Ishiguro is my favourite author, and while this isn't my favourite book of his, it is considered by many to be his best, and it's definitely a tearjerker. However, I can't really talk about why without spoiling it, and that's going to be true for most of these books actually, because quite often books end on a sad note and that's what makes us cry. I can't give that away. This book has one enormous twist, and once you know the twist, the tears will start to come. But I'm not going to spoil it, so I'll just give you a kind of summary. Never Let Me Go is a kind of science fiction novel, but at first it's not clear as to why. It's set in what we assume to be the present day in England, and we follow a woman who's in her early 30s. Her name is Kathy. Kathy works as a carer. That's all we know at the beginning. She cares for people who, I guess, are sick or disabled in some way. It's not clear. Kathy shows us her life, but she spends a lot of the early chapters of the book flashing back to her childhood. She was raised at a boarding school called Hailsham. Hailsham was different to other schools. Boarding schools are different anyway, but Hailsham was even more unique than that. There was a focus at this school on kids remaining healthy. They must at all times be as healthy as possible. And they also spent a lot of time making art. The art would be put on display or I think entered into competitions. Being imaginative and artistically carefree was encouraged, and so was being healthy, and we don't really know why. We spend a lot of time with Kathy and 2 of her friends at school, and slowly we learn the truth about what this school is and what's so unique about these kids. And once you learn it, once the themes start to fall into place, and these are themes of purpose and belonging and what it means to be human, relationships and love and how we spend our days. It's a book about the fragility of life, the fragility of so many things, the fragility of time and relationships. Once all of that comes to light and you get the context surrounding why those themes are important and hit so hard, you will cry. I cried multiple times reading this book. It's a tearjerker. It certainly feels that way, but it's more important than that. It's not cheap in any way. It is Kazuo Ishiguro exploring very, very difficult to define themes, or themes that seem so broad and universal, and yet digging into them and really exploring them takes a lot of guts, a lot of consideration, imagination, contemplation, and he does it all because he's a genius. He is my favorite writer, and this is a great example why. I cried so hard reading this book, and given how difficult it is for me to actually cry at a book, I truly find it hard to believe that anyone wouldn't. Never Let Me Go is something very, 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 very special. And here we have literally Little by Edward Carey. I've talked about this book quite a lot over the past year because I read it about a year ago, and it instantly became one of my top 5 favourite novels. I was truly staggered by the power of this novel. Little is the novelization of the life of a young woman who would go on to become the legendary Madame Tussauds, the woman who created incredible lifelike waxworks of people, and now we have Madame Tussauds places all over the world. And this is her story. Her real name, the name she was born with, was Marie. She was born around 1760 in a small town in France, and we follow her life. Her father dies early on. She is adopted by this eccentric, kind of mad scientist guy who teaches her everything that she needs to know about anatomy. Her mother also dies pretty early on as well, and then she and her master end up going to Paris and finding success there. I have a distinct memory of reading this book. I was visiting my parents last Christmas, and that's when I read this book. I read it across Christmas Day and Boxing Day, I think. I sped through it because I could not stop reading. And I remember it was Boxing Day, it was lunchtime, I was sitting in my parents' living room, and I was probably like 80% through this book, and something tragic happened that had me suddenly sobbing. My dad walks in, bringing me a sandwich, and he puts it down, and he's like, "What's wrong with you?" etc, etc. And I'm like, nothing, it's not, no, it's fine. It was this book. I was weeping because of something that happened in this book. And I was surprised. I was really shocked at the fact that it hit me so hard. The book is full of tragedy and loss and death, as I've already said, but a lot of it happens early on. And then about 80% through, I absolutely lost it, and I started bawling. It was rough. But this book is gorgeous. It is amazing. And I keep trying to stop myself from reading it again already because it's such a masterpiece. Heaven by Mieko Kawakami, translated into English by Sam Bett and David Boyd, seems like an obvious choice, and it is. Again, like Never Let Me Go, if you have read this book, you'll know it's an easy tearjerker, but it kind of feels cruel, and a lot of people have called the book that, or something similar. Heaven is not a nice book to read. It's about 2 kids who are severely bullied at school in different ways. They're a boy and a girl, and we primarily follow the story of the boy, and the girl kind of comes in and out, and their friendship solidifies and cements over time. He's a 14-year-old boy with a lazy eye. All of the boys in his class very unimaginatively just call him Eyes. And this was such a thing when we were at school. Bullies coming up with really terrible, strange nicknames. Just a depressing lack of imagination. But this is a book that makes a lot of people cry because it's full of bullying. Absolutely relentless bullying. There's a key scene in it that happens about halfway through, which I think I can spoil, where our protagonist is outside of school. He's in a waiting room, I think maybe in a hospital, and he sees one of his bullies there and finds the courage to confront him and say, "Why do you do what you do?" And the bully goes on this very philosophical rant about purpose and how there is no reason. We bully you because you were there. And it's horrible, and it made me cry. That was the moment. Not the moment where they put his head in a hollowed out football and kick it. The moment where the bully doesn't give him a satisfying answer, doesn't actually justify his own actions, the actions of the group. The emptiness, the pointlessness of it all, that's what made me cry. And I was heavily bullied at school. I was very, very alone in primary school. I had a decent group of kind of outcast friends in secondary school, and life was really hard. And as I said earlier, I feel a lot, and so kids would mock me for crying and getting upset, blah, blah, blah. I was one of those kids, and this book reminded me of all of that. What happens to this boy is worse than anything I experienced, but comparing yourself to someone who had it worse doesn't do your psyche a lot of good. I still related to this book in ways that I wasn't ready for or comfortable with, and that moment where it all seemed so meaningless, that really got to me, and that's what had me crying. I mentioned at the start that there was a book I just finished reading that made me cry for the first time in quite a while, and that was The Vaster Wilds by Lauren Groff. I cried at the end of this book. As I read the last page, the tears started to flow, and it took me by surprise. The ending honestly took me by surprise, and I cannot talk about it. The book came out this year, it's brand new, it's nice and fresh, and I'm not going to spoil the ending, but I have reviewed the book, so if you want to go watch that video and get my full thoughts on it, you'll probably see why I cried, even though I can't tell you what I cried at. The reason I cried was the immersion of this novel. Lauren Groff does such an incredible job of putting us in the shoes, in the mind, looking through the eyes of this girl. We are so alone with her throughout the entire novel. This book is set in the earliest days of colonialist USA. Just as Europeans were arriving and building settlements, our protagonist is a girl who was dragged across the ocean from London. She's in Jamestown, Virginia. I don't know much about it, but I was told from some people in my comments that it's very, very famous. I didn't study American history, this is a gap in my knowledge. There is a famine, the place is falling apart, and she leaves. Something triggers her escape, and as we go on, we learn what that thing was, and it's harrowing. But we spend the majority of this novel just running through the wilderness with her, experiencing everything she experiences, every step she treads, every smell, everything she sees. It's so involving and immersive. You truly forget who and what and where you are as you read this, because you kind of feel like you become her. And so as the book reaches its crescendo, as we find out exactly what happened to make her run, and we find out what happens to her at the end, all of these things just all come at once, and you feel it all because you're her, and you start to cry. That's what happened to me. It was harrowing, it was powerful, it was painful, but it also felt kind of cathartic. I was really grateful that I could cry. Quite often when I don't manage to cry, I think, I guess I've missed out on that feeling a little bit, but I still feel the feelings that make people cry. The tears just didn't come. But here I was particularly grateful that I actually cried, because I felt like that's what I was supposed to do in order to feel the catharsis, in order to feel the release, that the book was over and I'd made my way through it. There was something very cathartic about that. The Vaster Wilds is incredible, and I was surprised that it made me cry. And finally, we have what is for me the big one. This was the first book to make me cry. This is His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. I have a long personal history with these books. This collection is the whole trilogy, bound up together in a lovely everyman. I originally had the 3 books in paperback, and it was the end of the 3rd book that made me cry. I broke down in tears. I cried for like half an hour. I couldn't stop crying at the end of the 3rd book. I felt like I'd had my heart ripped out of my chest. I was like 16 years old and I was in pieces. I didn't know what to do, what to think. I remember frantically going on the internet to find out if there was going to be a next book, because I just couldn't believe it ended the way it did. I needed more. I needed a resolution. I didn't feel like I got it. Philip Pullman knows that, and I wanted more. Now, careful what you wish for. That's a real monkey paw thing, because we have now had a sequel, The Secret Commonwealth, and it was not good. It betrayed Philip Pullman's creepier tendencies. But this trilogy for me is still perfect, and I absolutely sobbed at the end of the 3rd one. These were the books that got me into reading. I started reading pretty late. I was 15, 16 when I read these. I hadn't read for pleasure at all until that point. I grew up in a household without books, parents who never told me to read, a school that didn't encourage me to read either. I always enjoyed the books I read at school, but not enough to know that I could take them home and actually read for pleasure. Books were something you did at school. And then suddenly a friend, who ironically was one of my primary school bullies, told me to read these. I did, and they changed everything. They are the reason that I'm standing here making YouTube videos about books. It's kind of funny that I'm talking about 2 books that made me cry, one of which was recommended to me by a guy who used to be my bully, and when I was talking about heaven, I was picturing him bullying me. And yet several years later, we became friends and he recommended me this book. It's weird how that all came full circle. I don't know what to think about that. If you've never read Northern Lights, which in the US is called The Golden Compass, and The Subtle Knife and The Amber Spyglass, you're in for a ride. I mean, I guess they're kids' books or YA books. I read them when I was a YA, so it made sense to me. I'm going to be rereading Northern Lights soon, and I'm very excited. I'll talk more about it then, but yeah, the end of this book, the end of the trilogy, is when I sobbed the most. The first time I ever cried, and the most I've ever cried at a book. There you go. Those were 5 books that made me cry. 2 were in the past year, so that's not bad. Like I said at the beginning, I don't cry very easily when it comes to books and films, and I wish I did more. Maybe the estrogen will keep having a nice effect and I'll start crying more. Maybe I wouldn't have cried at the Vaster Wilds if it wasn't for the estrogen. Dunno. Anyway, estrogen is great. Subscribe for books.